You know, today political attacks can fly across social media in a matter of seconds. But what if the sharpest weapon in a political fight wasn't a tweet or a meme, but a poem? We're going to jump back in time to 18th century England and take a look at an era when poetry wasn't just fancy words on a page, it was live ammunition.
Okay, so let's set the scene. The year is 1660. England is just breathing this massive sigh of relief because King Charles II is back from exile. This ends a really bloody civil war, the monarchy is restored, the theaters are reopening, London is basically throwing a massive party. But, like any good party, there's a problem. A really deep political tension just bubbling away right under the surface.
And right at the very heart of all that tension was this single really dangerous question. A question that had the power to throw the entire kingdom right back into total chaos. What on earth do you do when your popular king has no legitimate heir?
And this was a political time bomb just waiting to go off. First, you've got King Charles II himself. Super popular, very charming, but he has no legitimate kid to take the throne. Next in line, that's his brother James, who is an open and devout Catholic, which for a fiercely Protestant country like England was a terrifying thought. And then you have the wild card, the Duke of Monmouth. He's the king's handsome, Protestant, but illegitimate son, and a lot of people were starting to think he looked like a pretty good alternative.
So with the entire country basically on a knife's edge, the king's supporters knew they couldn't risk another war fought with swords. No way. So they turned to a completely different kind of weapon, one that could take down an enemy in public without ever firing a single shot.
And that weapon of choice was satire. Now the goal here wasn't just to make people laugh. The whole point of satire is to correct abuses by making powerful people look completely and utterly ridiculous. It's all about exposing their flaws for the entire world to see. It was sharp, it was often vicious, and believe me, it was incredibly effective.
Okay, so to wield a weapon like this, the king's party needed a real master, a pro, and they found one in John Dryden. He was England's very first official poet laureate. His job, basically, was to be the king's literary champion, and he did it with what was probably one of the sharpest pens in all of English history.
So, how did he actually do it? How did this work in practice? Well, let's go inside Dryden's most devastating political attack. It's a poem called Absalom and Achitophel, and we can see exactly how he just masterfully dismantled the king's opponents, line by brilliant line.
So here's the really clever part. Dryden couldn't just come out and name the king's enemies in a poem. I mean, that was literally treason. You could be executed for that. So instead, he used this brilliant disguise. He took a famous story from the Bible, one that pretty much everyone in his audience would know instantly, and used it as a perfect cover story, an allegory for the political mess that was unfolding in London.
The absolute genius of his plan was in the casting. King Charles II became the wise but troubled King David. The popular Duke of Monmouth? He was cast as Absalom, David's handsome but very rebellious son. And the real villain of the piece, the Earl of Shaftesbury, the politician who was pushing Monmouth to rebel, he was painted as Achitophel, the treacherous evil advisor.
And this attack was not subtle. I mean, look at this. You have the real Earl of Shaftesbury on one side, and his biblical stand-in, Achitophel, whispering poison into the ear of the young prince. Dryden wasn't just hinting at a comparison. He was basically drawing a giant, blinking arrow connecting Shaftesbury to one of the Bible's most famous villains.
And just listen to the language here. Dryden pulls zero punches. He calls him false Achitophel, a name that will be to all succeeding ages cursed. He paints him as this master of crooked counsels, whose brilliant mind is turbulent and dangerous. This wasn't just poetry. This was a public character assassination. And the crazy part? It worked. The poem was an instant bestseller. It helped swing public opinion right back against Shaftesbury and played a real part in the collapse of his movement.
Now, Dryden's poem was a massive sensation, but he wasn't working in a vacuum. This one attack was really just a single battle in a much, much larger war of words that came to define the entire era, what we now call England's Age of Satire.
This poetic warfare was really fueled by the clash between England's first two political parties. On one side, you had the Tories, people like Dryden who supported the king and the traditional hierarchy, and on the other side, you had the Whigs, led by guys like the Earl of Shaftesbury, who were all about the power of Parliament and were terrified of a return to absolute monarchy.
And this political pressure cooker produced other literary giants. The most famous one you've probably heard of, Jonathan Swift. Now, while Dryden used the Bible as his cover, Swift used fantastical fiction. His masterpiece, Gulliver's Travels, might feel like a kid's adventure story today, but back then it was understood as a savage critique of English politics and, well, human nature itself.
But here's the thing. The political arena wasn't the only place poetry was exploding. Away from all these satirical battles being fought by men, a totally different kind of literary revolution was quietly taking place, one that honestly has often been overlooked when we talk about this period.
263. Just let that number sink in for a second. That is how many women published poetry in this era. This was not some tiny fringe movement. This was a major literary force.
And what is so important to understand is that poetry was the most popular literary form for women writers. Forget the idea that they were silenced. More women were publishing poetry than were even publishing novels back then. And they used poetry to explore everything: friendship, love, social issues, creating this incredibly rich body of work that went way beyond the male-dominated political fights.
And the growth was just exponential. I mean, look at this. Before 1760, you might see an average of, say, 7 women publishing poetry in a decade. But by the 1790s, that number skyrocketed to 64. That is a nearly 10-fold increase. It was a genuine literary explosion that completely changed the face of English poetry.
Which brings us right back to where we started. The 18th century took the poem and turned it into a political weapon. It was their version of a viral video, a brutal takedown on TV, and a protest song all rolled into one. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? In our own age of information warfare, what has taken its place? What's the weapon of today?